Summer 1942. World War II was at its height. While major battles raged across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, a secret war came to American soil. This is the story of Operation Pastorius, one of Nazi Germany's most audacious attempts to strike at the United States on its own territory. Few people know that German saboteurs once set foot on the sandy beaches of Florida and Long Island. These are real events that could have changed the course of the war. A story that began in Berlin's intelligence offices and ended in an American death row cell. What drove 8 men to embark on a suicide mission? How did an ordinary Coast Guard patrol accidentally stumble upon Nazi spies? And why did an operation planned over months collapse within days? Today, we'll tell the complete story of Operation Pastorius, from its origins to its tragic conclusion. December 1941 changed everything. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, America entered the war. Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, not fully grasping the power of American industry. But some in the German command understood the threat. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was a complicated figure. An old-school aristocrat, he secretly despised the Nazi regime but continued to serve it. In early 1942, he received direct orders from high command to organize a retaliatory operation against America. American industry was ramping up, transforming the U.S. into the arsenal of democracy. Detroit factories churned out tanks, aircraft plants produced bombers, and shipyards launched destroyers and transports. Each day, America's industrial might grew, and with it, the threat to the Third Reich. Canaris proposed an ambitious plan. Small groups of specially trained saboteurs would infiltrate the American coast. Their targets would be key infrastructure, bridges over the Ohio River, railroad hubs, Alcoa aluminum plants, and hydroelectric stations on the Niagara River. They even planned to sabotage New York City's water supply system. The goal wasn't just physical destruction, it was psychological impact. America, protected by 2 oceans, needed to feel the war on its own soil. Panic, distrust, fear, that's what the operation was meant to create. If Americans started seeing German spies in every stranger, if factories shut down due to increased security checks, if the public demanded troops return home for protection, the operation would be considered successful. The operation received the codename Pastorius, after Franz Daniel Pastorius, founder of the first German settlement in America in Germantown, Pennsylvania, back in 1683. A symbolic name for a mission intended to remind America of the German presence on its soil. The operation required special people. These couldn't be ordinary soldiers or intelligence officers. The Abwehr began selecting candidates according to strict criteria. All had to speak fluent English, not textbook English, but natural American English with all its idioms and accents. They needed to know American culture from the inside, from baseball rules to popular radio programs. The choice fell on ethnic Germans who had lived in the United States for extended periods and returned to Germany for various reasons. 8 men passed the selection process, each with their own unique story. George Dosch, 39 years old, led the first group. He had lived in America for nearly 20 years, working as a waiter in upscale restaurants in New York and San Francisco. He knew the city like the back of his hand, could distinguish neighborhoods by the smell of street food and local accents. Dosch joined the Nazi Party more out of opportunism than conviction. Ernst Berger, 36 years old, had a dark past. He had once been a member of the SA Stormtroopers and even participated in the persecution of Jews. But his disillusionment with the regime led to his arrest and imprisonment in the Columbia concentration camp in 1942. He was released specifically for this operation, and Berger agreed, hoping to escape Germany by any means necessary. Herbert Haupt, 22 years old, was the youngest in the group. He grew up in Chicago, attended American schools, and played baseball with neighborhood kids. His parents were German immigrants, and in 1941, the family decided to return to their homeland. Haupt ended up in this operation almost by accident. He was recruited in Germany with promises he could return home. Richard Quirin worked as a mechanic in New York. Heinrich Heinck was a machinist. Hermann Neubauer worked as a cook. Edward Curling, leader of the second group, had lived in America since 1927 and considered himself a true American. Werner Thiel was the last on the list, a mechanic from Detroit, the Motor City. The training camp was located at Quenz Lake in a scenic area near Berlin. Here, isolated from the outside world, the 8 men spent 3 weeks in intensive preparation. Their instructor was an experienced Abwehr officer who had himself spent years in America. The saboteurs studied American life of 1942 in every detail. They read fresh newspapers delivered through neutral countries. They memorized the latest baseball scores. In May 1942, the Brooklyn Dodgers were leading. They listened to recordings of popular radio programs and songs. Bing Crosby's White Christmas was everywhere. They studied prices of goods, street names, and subway routes. Technical training was equally important. They learned to handle plastic explosives and various types of detonators, mechanical, electrical, and time-delayed. They practiced making incendiary devices from available materials. Practical exercises were conducted at abandoned factories, where they trained to identify vulnerable points in industrial facilities. Each man received carefully prepared false documents, identity cards, driver's licenses, draft registration cards. All were executed flawlessly, using genuine American forms obtained by intelligence services. They were issued American clothing, suits, shirts, shoes, even underwear with American factory labels. Their pockets contained the small items every American carries: matchboxes from local bars, movie tickets, store receipts. Money was a crucial part of their equipment. Each group received a substantial sum in American dollars, a total of about $175,000 altogether. This was a fortune at the time, enough to live on for several years. The bills were genuine, collected from various sources to avoid suspicion of counterfeiting. On May 27, 1942, 2 submarines departed from the French port of Lorient on the west coast of occupied France. U-202, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Hans-Heinz Linder, headed for Long Island with 4 saboteurs aboard: Dasch, Berger, Quirin, and Heinck. U-584, under Captain Lieutenant Joachim Deka, headed for the Florida coast with the remaining group: Curling, Haupt, Thiel, and Neubauer. The journey across the Atlantic took nearly 3 weeks and tested everyone's endurance. Type 7 submarines, while effective combat vessels, weren't designed for comfort. A crew of 50 men plus 4 passengers were crammed into a steel tube about 70 meters long. The boats traveled on the surface at night, using diesel engines and charging batteries for daytime submersion. During the day, they dove to depth, hiding from Allied air patrols. American and British aircraft constantly patrolled the Atlantic, and an encounter with them could mean the end of the mission. Conditions aboard were unbearable. The saboteurs slept in narrow bunks among torpedoes and machinery. They breathed stale air, saturated with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and mustiness. Temperature fluctuated from the cold, damp air of the North Atlantic to stifling heat near the engines. Fresh water was strictly rationed, no more than a glass per day for washing. Food consisted of canned goods, hardtack, and whatever could be stored for weeks without refrigeration. Fresh produce ran out in the first days of the voyage. The smell of cooking food mixed with other submarine odors, creating a nauseating combination. Many suffered from seasickness, especially when storm waves rocked the boat. Danger lurked at every turn. The Atlantic was a battlefield. Allied convoys crossed the ocean under escort by destroyers and corvettes equipped with sonar and depth charges. A chance encounter could mean hours of underwater pursuit, with depth charges exploding around the hull. The submarine commanders received strict orders: deliver the groups as close to shore as possible and land them during darkness. The operation required absolute secrecy. Not a single shot fired, not the slightest trace of German presence. The mission's success depended on Americans not learning of the landing until after the sabotage began. As they approached the American coast, tension grew. Coastal waters were particularly dangerous. Shallow depths made submarines vulnerable, and Coast Guard patrols were vigilant. In 1942, after a series of successful German submarine attacks on merchant vessels off American shores, coastal defenses had been strengthened. The night of June 13, 1942, was dark and foggy. U-202 surfaced off Amagansett Beach on the eastern tip of Long Island, about 100 miles from New York. Dense fog enveloped the coast, ideal conditions for a covert landing. It was around 11 at night. Dash and his companions, Berger, Quirin, and Heinck, descended into an inflatable rubber boat through the torpedo hatch. They wore German naval infantry uniforms. In case of capture, this would give them prisoner of war status under international conventions. Civilian clothes were worn underneath. They brought 4 heavy crates of explosives, detonators, and equipment, packed in waterproof containers. 4 sailors from the submarine rowed toward shore. The waves were moderate. The boat moved silently. About 100 meters from shore, the boat ran aground. There wasn't enough depth. The saboteurs had to jump into waist-deep water and drag the crates to shore. They pulled the boat onto the sand and began working quickly and methodically. The crates needed to be buried in the sand dunes. They'd return for them later, once they'd established themselves in the city. Shovels worked rapidly, digging a hole in the wet sand. They also planned to bury their naval uniforms here. Suddenly, a figure with a flashlight emerged from the fog. It was 21-year-old John Cullen, a Coast Guardsman patrolling this stretch of beach. He was unarmed, just a routine patrol checking the beach for contraband or trespassers. George Dash instantly assessed the situation. Panic could doom them all. He quickly stepped toward the guard, introducing themselves as fishermen who'd washed ashore. His English was flawless, without the slightest accent. Cullen shined his flashlight and saw a suspicious scene. 4 men in wet clothes, crates, shovels. Through the fog, he made out the dark silhouette of a submarine at sea. The young guard understood he'd stumbled onto something serious and dangerous. Dash acted quickly. First, he tried to intimidate the guard, then abruptly changed tactics. He pulled out a wad of bills, $260, more than a month's Coast Guard salary, and offered it to Cullen. The offer was clear: take the money and forget what you saw. The young guard hesitated. He was alone, unarmed, and 4 strong men surrounded him in the darkness. Fear for his life overcame his sense of duty. He took the bills and quickly retreated into the fog, looking over his shoulder. Dash asked his name, and the guard, flustered, gave the first name that came to mind. As soon as Cullen disappeared from view, the saboteurs panicked. They frantically covered the crates with sand, threw their uniforms in the same hole, and hastily smoothed over the sand. Within 10 minutes, they were running through the dunes toward the Amagansett train station. The station was deserted. The small station building was closed. They sat on a bench and waited for the morning train, shivering in their wet clothes. Every sound made them jump. Finally, at 6 in the morning, a train to New York arrived. By 7, they were sitting in a car heading to the heart of Manhattan. Meanwhile, John Cullen ran back to his Coast Guard station. He burst inside and reported to his superior, Chief Boatswain's Mate Warren Barnes. His story sounded incredible, but the money in his pocket was real proof. Barnes immediately gathered a group of 6 men, and they returned to the beach with weapons and flashlights. By dawn, they found tracks in the sand leading to the dunes. They started digging and discovered the buried crates. The first crate contained German uniforms with eagles and swastikas. The second, explosives in blocks. The third, detonators, wires, timing mechanisms. The fourth, incendiary devices and instructions in German. This was a sensation. Nazi saboteurs had landed on American soil. Barnes immediately contacted higher command. By noon, representatives of military intelligence and the FBI arrived at the beach. The hunt for the unknown saboteurs began. 4 days later, on the night of June 17th, U-584 reached the Florida coast. The second group of saboteurs, Curling, Haupt, Thiel, and Neubauer, landed at Ponte Vedra Beach, about 25 miles south of Jacksonville. The landing went without incident. The dark southern night concealed their actions. They buried their crates deep in the sand and carefully camouflaged the location. They changed into civilian clothes, destroying their uniforms. By morning, they were at a bus stop, and then in Jacksonville. From there, Curling and Thiel headed to New York, while Haupt and Neubauer went to Chicago. Meanwhile, the first group had settled in New York. Dash and Berger rented a room at the Hotel Governor Clinton in Manhattan. Quirin and Heinck stayed separately. They had money, documents, and blended into the city crowds. New York in 1942 lived its usual life, slightly seasoned by wartime. The city was full of life and contrasts. Times Square sparkled with lights, though dimmed due to partial blackouts. Restaurants and bars were packed with customers. Soldiers and sailors on leave walked the streets. War bonds were being sold, and patriotic posters with Uncle Sam hung everywhere. The saboteurs were supposed to lie low for a few weeks, get their bearings, establish contacts with German sympathizers, and then begin carrying out their assignments. The list of targets was extensive, from blowing up bridges to sabotage at military factories. But George Dash couldn't sleep. In the luxurious hotel room overlooking the lit streets of Manhattan, he spent a sleepless night. The encounter with the Coast Guardsmen haunted him. He understood. They'd been discovered. The crates of explosives and uniforms had surely been found by now. It was only a matter of time before the FBI traced them. Moreover, Dash had never been a convinced Nazi. America had been his home for 20 years. He knew these streets, these people. The thought of blowing up bridges, killing innocent workers, destroying what he considered his home, it disgusted him. Ernst Berger shared his doubts. His arrest by the Gestapo, beatings, and imprisonment in Columbia concentration camp had made him an enemy of the regime. He'd agreed to this mission only to escape Germany. Now he was in America, but as an enemy. The two men met in their hotel room late at night on June 14th. The conversation lasted for hours. They discussed their options. Attempting to carry out the mission was impossible. They were already being hunted. Hiding and disappearing into America was risky. Their documents might not withstand thorough inspection. The only option left was to surrender to authorities. On the morning of June 15th, Dash called the FBI's Washington office. The secretary didn't take him seriously. Dash insisted. He needed to meet personally with Director Hoover. He spoke of German spies, explosives, plans for sabotage on American soil. After several transfers from one department to another, his words finally attracted the attention of senior agents. Dash was allowed to come to Washington. On June 16th, he boarded a train and after several hours was in the capital. At the FBI building on Pennsylvania Avenue, several agents, led by the assistant director, met him. They took him to an interrogation room. Dash laid out everything. He told them about the training camp at Quenn's Lake, about crossing the Atlantic in submarines, about landing on Long Island. He named all the participants, described their appearances, and gave their possible addresses. He told them about the Florida group, though he didn't know the exact location of their landing. He described targets for sabotage, the Hellgate Bridge in New York, aluminum plants in Tennessee, the hydroelectric station at Niagara Falls. As proof, he provided money, maps with marked targets, and instructions for making explosive devices written in invisible ink on handkerchiefs. The agents listened with growing astonishment. This was a goldmine of information. Dash demanded protection for himself and Berger in return, as well as guarantees they wouldn't be executed. FBI agents didn't make direct promises, but assured him that their cooperation would be taken into account during sentencing. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI director, saw this as an opportunity for triumph. The FBI had been under pressure from critics for ineffectiveness in fighting espionage. Now he had a chance to show the world his agency's professionalism. He immediately ordered the launch of the largest operation to arrest the saboteurs. The FBI deployed a massive manhunt. Hundreds of agents in New York, Chicago, and Jacksonville received photographs and detailed descriptions of the suspects. A total check of all hotels, boarding houses, and restaurants began. Agents set up surveillance at train stations and bus stations. Work proceeded around the clock. On June 20th, agents picked up Quirin's trail in New York. They followed him for 2 days, expecting he would lead them to other participants. On June 22nd, they took him in a Brooklyn apartment without a single shot. That same day, they arrested Heinrich Heinck in Manhattan. He didn't even have time to understand what happened. In Chicago, the operation developed in parallel. Agents established round-the-clock surveillance on the home of Herbert Haupt's parents. The young man, not suspecting danger, came to visit his parents. On June 22nd, when he stepped onto the porch of the house, agents surrounded him. Haupt didn't even try to resist. He was caught completely off guard. Hermann Neubauer was detained at a Chicago hotel on June 23rd. Edward Curling was captured in Florida on June 27th, when he was meeting with a possible contact among German sympathizers. Werner Thiel was arrested in New York the same day, the last of the 8 saboteurs. By the end of June, all 8 participants in Operation Pastorius were in custody. The FBI operation had been conducted brilliantly and took less than 2 weeks. The American press exploded with sensational headlines. Citizens were both shocked and encouraged. Shocked that the enemy could so easily penetrate American territory. Encouraged that the FBI had dealt with the threat so quickly. Hoover skillfully used the situation to enhance his agency's prestige. In FBI press releases, the operation was presented as the result of brilliant work by agents and analysts, naturally keeping silent about the fact that the key role was played by the voluntary betrayal of the saboteurs themselves. President Franklin Roosevelt personally made the decision about the captive's fate. An ordinary civilian trial with a jury was ruled out. There was too great a risk of acquittal on technical legal nuances, and the process could be too lengthy. Instead, Roosevelt issued a special order to convene a military commission, a military tribunal of 7 U.S. Army generals. The trial began on July 8, 1942, in the Department of Justice building in Washington. Sessions were held in the strictest secrecy behind closed doors. The press and public were not admitted. The defendants were provided with military lawyers, Colonel Kenneth Royal and Colonel Cassius Dowell, who defended their clients honestly and professionally, despite the obvious hopelessness of the case. The prosecution's case was ironclad. Testimony from Dash and Berger, explosives found on the beaches, detonators, maps with marked targets, German military uniforms. All of this left no doubt about the defendant's guilt. The prosecutor, Major General Myron Kramer, methodically built the case, presenting evidence piece by piece. The defense tried to argue that the accused wore military uniforms during landing and therefore should be considered prisoners of war, not spies or saboteurs. However, the fact that they immediately changed into civilian clothes and planned to operate incognito among the civilian population completely destroyed this argument. In August 2nd, the military commission reached a unanimous verdict. All 8 saboteurs were found guilty of espionage, violation of the laws and customs of war, and attempted sabotage. The sentence was maximum severity, death by electric chair for all 8. However, President Roosevelt personally intervened and commuted the sentences for Dash and Berger, recognizing the value of their cooperation with authorities. Dash received 30 years imprisonment. Berger was sentenced to life imprisonment. The remaining 6 awaited execution of the death sentence. On August 8, 1942, a Saturday, 6 death sentences were carried out at the District of Columbia Jail. An electric chair was installed in a specially prepared room. Executions began at exactly noon. Herbert Haupt, the youngest of the group, at just 22 years old, went first. He was followed by Heinck, Quirin, Curling, Neubauer, and Thiel. Each execution took about 15 minutes. By 2:30 in the afternoon, it was all over. This was the largest mass execution conducted by federal civilian authorities of the United States during World War II. The bodies of the executed were buried on prison grounds in unmarked graves, without any identifying markers. Operation Pastorius ended in crushing failure for Nazi Germany and triumph for American intelligence services. German command learned their lesson. No further attempts were made to land saboteurs on American territory. The lesson was learned. America, even separated by thousands of miles of ocean, was well protected by the vigilance of its citizens and the effectiveness of its intelligence services. George Dash served in federal prison until April 1948. After the war ended, President Harry Truman pardoned him and Berger, after which both were deported to post-war Germany. Dash settled in West Germany and lived a long life, dying in 1992 at the age of 89. Until the end of his days, he justified his decision to betray his comrades as necessary to save human lives, and his unwillingness to harm the country he had considered home for 20 years. The story of Operation Pastorius became an important warning and lesson for future generations. It showed how thin the line is between duty and betrayal, between blind patriotism and the instinct for self-preservation, between orders and conscience. It demonstrated that war isn't just grand battles of tank armies and aerial bombardments, but also covert operations, personal dramas, and the moral dilemmas of individual people. The secret war on American beaches lasted only 14 days, from the moment of the first landing on June 13th to the last arrest on June 27, 1942. But its echoes and consequences were felt for a long time afterward. It heightened Coast Guard vigilance, tightened security measures at strategic facilities, and increased attention to possible enemy sympathizers within the country. Operation Pastorius remains in history as a failed attempt, but also as a vivid reminder that during wartime, the front line can run anywhere, even on peaceful sandy beaches of Long Island and Florida, where ordinary American families sunbathe and children build sandcastles, unaware that just a few years earlier, a real spy drama unfolded there.